Hello everyone, welcome to this video. This is really a continuation of our networking discussion from the last video. In the last video, we looked at a common problem. So someone is going to give you an IP address and typically they would ask, okay, figure out the subnet ID, your broadcast address, and the first usable IP address and the last usable IP address. And this is kind of what we followed. In this one, we are going to work with a class B IP address. So I'm going to use this one this time instead of 10. Let's get that one and put it in here. So the first thing, this is a specific IP address. Okay, this is how I have. You can write down the IP address using a CIDR notation. Okay, so this tells me, because it's /24, it tells me my subnet mask is still going to remain the same as of the last one, where we had a 10.ip address with /24. That means first 3 octet they're completely full, so 255, 255, 255, 0 is still valid. And let's just clean up this, and then we'll just work through it again. And let's write down the IP address that is given to us. So 172 15, then 55 and 13. So this is one specific IP address in a particular subnet. So our goal is to find the subnet ID. So we know that for subnet ID, your last octet has to be 0. So we can make that, and we also know that in a broadcast address, the last octet is completely full. That means it's 255. And we know the network portion does not change no matter what, because it's 255, 255, 255, 0. So we can pretty much copy this, right, and put it in here. So there we go. So we have got most of it done now. The last thing we want to do, so figure out the last and first usable IP address. So in a typical network, if you have on-prem, you should be able to use 172.15.55.1, and you should be able to use all the way up to 172.15.55 to 54. Okay, so you should have that many, so 254 usable IP address in a subnet that has 256 IP address available. Two of them are reserved, one for the subnet ID, another for the broadcast address. Now in Azure, in addition to these two, you have 3 more IP addresses that are reserved for Azure's own purpose, and that would be 1.1, .2, and .3. So once you create this subnet in Azure and you deploy your first resource, say virtual machine, the first usable IP address would be 172.15.55.4, okay, and not 1. Okay, so that's something that you have to remember. Now let's go to Azure and see. Actually, let's copy this one first. Okay, so we have a reference, and let's come down. Let's go to Azure. So what we did in our last video, so we created one virtual network. I should have named it more generic, but we were working with class A type address. We just called it virtual network as taste class A. But what we did, if you go to the address space, so the way you go, so you come down to your home, your portal, and I'm just interested in my virtual network, so I'm just going to search for the virtual network, and I have a few. So I'm going to go to this one. The first thing, it's just telling me in the overview blade that I have uh, I have one Windows machine. I have one network interface where I'm using one of the IPs from that subnet that I have. Okay, so the thing that we are interested in, the address space. So here, this is the address space that we have used. This is a class A IP address with /24 CIDR. So that means this address space got 256 number of IP addresses technically. But if you go to subnet, I created only one subnet and put all of the IP address in there. Right now it's saying that I have only 250 available because I have already used one of them for one of the Windows machines. Okay. So one thing that we can do, we can actually add additional address space to one particular big virtual network. So let's just do that. So we're gonna try to add this particular uh, address space, but you notice that if I put it just like that, it's gonna tell me, hey, this is not a valid CID notation. Use the subnet ID instead. So this 13 is actually referring to one specific IP address. It's not referring to a range. So if I use 0, now it's going to allow me to add that IP address range to my virtual network. So let's save this one. So now, interestingly, I have one virtual network. In this virtual network, I have two different IP address range, and if I want, I can divide this IP address into multiple subnet, this IP address range in multiple subnet as well. But what we are gonna do, let's come back to subnet and let's see if we can break this IP address into another big subnet. Okay, so call that big subnet. This is for IP address B, so I'm just gonna call it B. And I could break this one into smaller subnets if I go with 25. Okay, I can do that, and that will just break. If I take one more bit, it is gonna break my subnet into half. So instead of 256, now I have 123. But I want to just keep this as one big subnet at this time for the simplicity of this tutorial. So in this IP address range, I also need an subnet before I can start using it. So I'm just gonna put all of the IP address in this big subnet, and I'm just gonna call it 172.15.55.0/24, and hit save, and that should add that particular subnet. So now I have another subnet. Now in this one, you see that I have all of the IP addresses now available to me because I have not deployed anything. So again, if you go back to address space, those are the two address space. Technically, both of them has 256 IP addresses in those octets because 2 to the power 8 is 256. But since Azure reserves 5 of them, 251 are usable to us. Now the next thing that I want to do, I want to deploy one virtual machine. Okay, so let's just create a resource, and let's just do Windows 2019 again. Let's just do win sub B, and let's just use something that they have. This is not working for me, so this is gonna work. So uh, I'm gonna add some password, and over here, okay, so I got the password and the username. Disk, I don't need to worry about, I'm not interested in here. uh, so this is the new range. No, this is not the one that we want. Which one do we want? We want, let's see, class. Here, so that was the virtual network. In this virtual network, this time we wanted to work with the 172.15.55.0. Okay, and then what we need, we just need to deploy this virtual machine. So we don't really have to do anything else. And Azure should automatically assign the first, they do it sequentially. The first available IP address it's going to assign to this particular virtual machine, and the deployment really takes like less than a minute these days. So we'll take a look at what is the IP address. And as I have discussed, so the first four and the last one is reserved. So the first IP address would be dot dot 4 in this case in that particular subnet. So let's just wait for one more second and it should be done. So just think about the architecture that we have created. We have created one VNet. In this VNet, in the previous lab, we created one subnet uh, with a .10 address space. Then we added another address space with class B 172, and then we have deployed machines in them. So let's come back over here and just to verify and prove my point. So we have created this particular virtual machine in that particular virtual network where this is the first available IP address is 172.15.55.4, and that's what I told you, that all these three plus 0 they're reserved for Azure. So the first address in Azure, you could say, starts at 4 and not 1. Okay, so that is an important thing to remember. And so if you have a small network and you are dividing into multiple times, every single time you are dividing, you are losing 5 of those IP addresses, so that you cannot use, and it has to be used for the Azure. So keep that in mind. Okay, so last thing that I wanted to discuss, but maybe I'll cover it in the next video. So now if you look at our architecture, let's go back to our where should we go? Let's go back to the virtual network. So we have now one virtual network, and interestingly, in this virtual network I have two different address space now, and I have two different virtual machines that are deployed in this address space and another in this address space. A question for you: do you think they will be able to talk to each other because they're part of one big virtual network, or can they not talk to each other because we are using a two different address space? Okay, so I'll let you work on that, design this, deploy your virtual machine and test out, and let me know what you think. We'll do this exercise in the next video, so if you have trouble, we'll find out the answer very soon. Okay, thanks for watching the video. Hope you have learned something. If you like the video, hit the like button. If you think that I can explain this in a better way, please leave a comment. I would appreciate that a lot as well. Thank you. Have a great day.